Hi guys, my name's Halina and I'm going to be talking to you about students' perceptions of exclusion in Spanish. Exclusion and discrimination are hot topics at the moment. We're talking more and more about issues such as racism, religious intolerance and homophobia, and we're tackling their manifestations through things like the law or access to healthcare. The issue that I'm going to be talking about, sexism, has recently gained worldwide attention through campaigns such as the Women's March or He for She. But how is this connected to language? Well, language is our principal means of communication. We use language every day to express our ideas and to communicate with those around us. Given its central role to our existence, some have suggested that language plays an important part in gender construction, and it's partly through our understanding of the separate groups of men and women that we perceive these separate groups within society. Given its central role then, it's possible that language could be connected to the types of discrimination that I mentioned earlier. What's more, we often don't stop to question the language we're using, especially with our native language, since it seems so natural to us. When you're learning a new language though, as I am with Spanish, you're learning a totally new system of classification of the world, and for this reason you have a slightly outsider view of it, and it might seem you have a different view there. For this reason, it's possible that if the unequal treatment of gender within the language is connected to the sexism that I mentioned earlier, we should perhaps be teaching different types of language or including them. But what does the unequal treatment of gender within language mean? Well, in English, if I want to refer to the group of men and women I hang out with, I can use the gender-neutral term friends. In Spanish, though, this works slightly differently. So if I want to refer to just my female friends, I use the feminine version of the word for friend, amigas, which is marked by the letter A. By the same token, if I want to refer to only my male friends, I use the masculine version of this word, which is marked by the letter O. Interestingly though, in Spanish, the masculine version has two functions. It has this first, male-only function, and it has a second, generic capacity. So yeah, the masculine has these two functions, the male-only function and the wider generic function. This is the same regardless of the number of women present. If there's just one man, we will use masculine terms. Many, including the Spanish Academy, who regulate the official usage of Spanish, say that this is just a neutral aspect of grammar and it shouldn't be taken as discriminatory. However, others have suggested that it contributes to a system that makes women invisible, and for this reason, changing language or adapting language could be part of our broader struggle to achieve gender equality. Their suggestions have led to the proposition of various inclusive language guidelines, which have been published by institutions such as universities, and recently gained media attention when they were used by the new Prime Minister of Spain. Calling them inclusive language doesn't necessarily suggest that other types of language are exclusive. As you'll see from my findings and those of many others, this isn't necessarily the experience of speakers, and for that reason I'll be calling other types of language traditional language. The inclusive language guidelines usually propose three different changes. The first is the use of the @ sign in place of the gender marking A or O, since it incorporates both of those letters. The second is to replace the masculine term with both the masculine and the feminine. And the third is to remove the gender term altogether and to use gender-neutral terms such as people. My project aimed to explore what students at the university thought of these changes in contrast to traditional language. As I said before, we're non-native speakers, so we occupy this outsider position to Spanish. For this reason, we might have a slightly different view of it. I interviewed 5 female final year students at the university about their opinions of this. I used some questions that I prepared before, and I also used some prompts. The first prompt that I used was taken from a newspaper article. In the first version of the article, I'd used only the generic masculine to refer to mixed gender groups. And in the second, I'd replaced this with inclusive language alternatives, as you can see here. I also showed them 5 sentences, and I asked them if they felt included by them. These included a mixture of the generic masculine and inclusive language. I also included the dictionary definition of man that refers to man as the rational animal, referring of course to mankind. So the first important finding, I'll show you my findings here with quotes that I've taken from the interviews. So the first important finding is that participants did perceive exclusion within Spanish. This was most strongly linked to the definition of mankind, and all of them, apart from one, said that they felt excluded by this. The one that said that she did feel included said that this arose from her recognition that although she is a woman and identifies as a woman, she knows that in this aspect of a language, she is simultaneously treated as a man. The generic capacity of the masculine also caused some frustration for them, since they felt that it contributed to this idea of making women invisible, and women then just get lumped in with men and others. These suggestions contradict the Spanish Academy's assertion that grammar is entirely neutral and non-discriminatory. However, even though they identified these aspects, none of them actively felt excluded themselves. They thought that it could be an experience that other women might have, but they didn't have it personally. Given their identification of these aspects that could be exclusionary, they were generally sympathetic to inclusive language. They thought it could be more extensive, and it means that we're not just using the masculine part to refer to the whole population. They were particularly sympathetic towards the @ sign, since it incorporates both the A and the O. However, they were slightly critical of the use of split forms, the use of both the masculine and the feminine, since they thought that non-binary people could still feel excluded by this. They thought that if you mentioned the masculine and the feminine explicitly, and somebody felt that they didn't belong to either of those groups, they might still feel excluded. Some of them suggested perhaps we could use the @ sign to overcome this, and this is happening frequently, especially on social media. But the problem arises in spoken language, since we still don't have a received pronunciation for a word such as this. Given the central role of education to participants' language use and language learning, their education was a key part of our discussion. We saw that none of the participants, although they felt sympathetic towards inclusive language, didn't feel comfortable using it within university. This was the case even for one participant who said that she felt that she used it in all other aspects of her Spanish usage. Their decision not to use it within university was strongly linked to their thought that they would be marked down and marked negatively for this kind of language. For this reason, they thought that it would be beneficial for them to be taught inclusive language alongside traditional grammar usage. The final finding I want to draw attention to is the strong link that the participants perceived between the language that we use and our view of the world. They thought that the dominance of the masculine over the feminine could be linked to this wider experience of sexism we have in society and male privilege. For this reason, they thought that inclusive language could be an important part of our wider struggle to achieve gender equality. However, they didn't think that just changing language would be the only way to achieve this. They thought it could be an important tool in this struggle, but they didn't think it would be the solution in itself. So what have we learned about the intersection of language within discrimination? Well, my study was really small and it can't be generalised from, but it adds to a growing body of research that suggests that this is an issue that we should be paying attention to. Language is something that we use every day, often without thinking about and often without questioning. For example, at the start of this presentation you might not have noticed, but I referred to using the word guys, and perhaps you haven't stopped to wonder why, if when one guy is only ever a man, we can still use this term generically. This is the closest parallel we have in English to this situation in Spanish. So we have a long way to go before we achieve gender equality, but perhaps questioning language could form part of that solution as well. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
What you're talking about is really, I think it's very controversial right now, because there's a lot of people who think negatively about changing language. Even in France, I think they tried to, or they were suggesting about changing some words to make them more inclusive, but like a lot of people were against it. Why would you think that there's such negativeness towards inclusive language?
I think part of it is that obviously languages such as Spanish and French are very old languages. They have a long history. They're also regulated by bodies that are predominantly made up of men, particularly older men. So there's not that much diversity of opinion in changing language. So it's possible that we're not seeing that much change because the people involved in regulating language and in deciding what language we should be using represent quite a limited opinion. But I think social media and like broader usage, particularly within activists, is changing that. So it might be something we see change over time. But
Yeah, so my question is, which mode of inclusive language, and specifically in Spanish, would you think is most likely to succeed? Considering also other languages, for example, like in German or languages of that family, also do the distinction between male and female with, including both forms.
I think, particularly for English speakers, the third option of using non-gender marked words is going to be one of the easiest to adopt because it's the least disruptive to how we use, how language works. If you use both the masculine and the feminine in Spanish, this runs into a lot of problems because adjectives and other words also agree with the noun, so you would have to repeat many, many words and the sentence becomes really long. There's also the problem of, like I said, with the @ sign, you can't pronounce that, so it's a really easy change to make like when you're typing on social media and stuff, but it's not that easy to incorporate in your spoken language. It also doesn't really look that official, so if you use it within an essay, it would look really strange to us. So I think that the third option is probably going to be the first one that becomes most popular, yeah.